Thomas Morgan wiped the sweat from his brow as the merciless summer sun beat down on his weathered face. 58 years of working this land had etched deep lines around his eyes, testament to both laughter and hardship. The drought had persisted for the third consecutive season, and his once fertile fields now resembled a patchwork of cracked earth and withered crops. The farm that had sustained generations of Morgans was slowly dying before his eyes. With a heavy sigh, Thomas climbed into his rusted pickup truck. The engine protested before reluctantly sputtering to life. He needed to make a supply run to town, though his list had grown shorter with each passing month. As the bank account dwindled, so did his options. The truck rattled down the dusty road, past neighboring farms that told similar stories of struggle. Agriculture had never been an easy life, but climate change and economic pressures had transformed challenging into nearly impossible. Main Street was quiet as Thomas parked outside Wilson's General Store. The small town of Riverdale had seen better days. Storefronts stood empty where family businesses had once thrived, casualties of the big box stores that had sprung up 30 miles down the highway. Thomas nodded to a few familiar faces as he entered the store, his boots leaving dusty prints on the worn linoleum floor. "Morning, Thomas," called Sam Wilson from behind the counter. "How are things holding up out there?" "Still standing," Thomas replied with the practiced resilience of a man who'd weathered many storms. "For now, anyway." He gathered his modest supplies, feed for the few animals that remained, basic groceries, and some machine oil. At the counter, he hesitated before removing a bottle of painkillers from his basket. His arthritis medication would have to wait another week. The drive home felt longer than usual. The foreclosure notice he'd received last week weighed heavily on his mind. 6 months. That was all the time he had left to somehow find the money to save the farm. His daughter Emily had offered to help, but with 2 kids in college and her husband's recent layoff, Thomas couldn't bring himself to accept. This burden was his to bear. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Thomas noticed something unusual on the side of the road about a mile from his property. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree branch, but as he drew closer, he realized it was an animal. He slowed the truck, pulling onto the shoulder. A horse lay on its side, its ribs visibly protruding through a dull brown coat. Thomas approached cautiously. The animal's breathing was shallow, its eyes half closed. It was clearly severely malnourished and dehydrated, possibly abandoned by someone who could no longer afford its upkeep, a sadly common occurrence these days. "Hey there," Thomas said softly, kneeling despite the protest from his knee joints. The horse's ear twitched at his voice, but it made no attempt to rise. Thomas reached out slowly, placing a gentle hand on the animal's neck. The horse flinched but remained still, too weak to resist. Thomas examined the animal more closely. No visible injuries, but its condition was dire. Without intervention, it wouldn't survive another day in this heat. There was no identification, no brand that he could see. Just a desperate creature at the end of its rope. Common sense told Thomas to call animal control and let them handle it. He had enough problems without taking on a half-dead horse that would require care he could barely afford for himself. But something in the animal's eyes, a quiet dignity despite its suffering, stirred something in the old farmer's heart. "Damn it all," he muttered, returning to his truck to retrieve a blanket and water bottle. He knelt again, lifting the horse's head gently to let a trickle of water wet its cracked lips. The animal drank weakly, its tongue working slowly to capture the precious moisture. Getting the horse into his truck would be impossible alone. Thomas pulled out his cell phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing. "Hey, Mike, I need a favor." 30 minutes later, Mike Peterson's truck pulled up alongside Thomas's. Mike was a younger farmer from 2 properties over, one of the few who had managed to diversify enough to keep his head above water. "Jesus, Tom," Mike said, surveying the horse. "This one's about ready for the glue factory." "It's still breathing," Thomas replied, more sharply than he'd intended. "Can you help me get it to my place or not?" Mike shrugged. "Your funeral." "But yeah, I brought the trailer." Together, they managed to coax the horse to its feet, just long enough to lead it up the ramp into Mike's trailer. The animal collapsed again once inside, its strength completely spent. "You sure about this, Tom?" Mike asked as they secured the trailer. "Vet bills ain't cheap, and from the looks of it, this one's gonna need plenty of care." Thomas nodded, avoiding Mike's concerned gaze. "I'm sure." Back at the farm, they maneuvered the horse into Thomas's old barn. The building had once housed a dozen horses in its prime, when his father had run a small breeding operation alongside the crops. Now it stood mostly empty, save for his ancient tractor and some weathered tools. "I'll bring by some of my good hay tomorrow," Mike offered as they settled the horse on a fresh bed of straw. "And I know a vet who might give you a discount if I ask nice." "I appreciate that," Thomas said, his pride taking a back seat to necessity. After Mike left, Thomas sat on an overturned bucket beside the horse. Night had fallen, and the barn was illuminated only by a single hanging bulb that cast long shadows across the dirt floor. "What am I doing?" he asked aloud. The horse's eye opened slightly, regarding him with what Thomas could have sworn was gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. I might just be prolonging your suffering." He filled a shallow pan with water and placed it where the horse could reach by merely extending its neck. Then he mixed a thin gruel of oats and water, hoping the animal might manage to consume something. To his surprise, the horse made a valiant effort, lapping weakly at the mixture. "That's it," Thomas encouraged. "Small steps." Before leaving the barn, Thomas laid a gentle hand on the horse's neck. "I'll be back in the morning. Try to hang on till then." As he walked back to his silent house, Thomas wondered what Emily would say if she could see him now, taking in a dying horse when he could barely keep his own life from falling apart. But something about the animal's quiet determination resonated with him. Perhaps they were kindred spirits of a sort, both holding on against the odds, refusing to surrender to circumstances beyond their control. Thomas paused on his porch, looking back at the barn where a solitary light still burned. Tomorrow would bring what it would. For tonight, he had done what he could. Sometimes that had to be enough. Thomas awoke before dawn, his body following the rhythm of decades despite his retirement from active farming. His joints ached as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, reminding him of all the years he'd spent bent over fields and fixing machinery. A quick glance at the clock, 4:37 a.m. He'd slept fitfully, his dreams punctuated by images of emaciated horses and foreclosure notices. The memory of yesterday's rescue flooded back, and Thomas dressed hurriedly, wondering if the horse had survived the night. He brewed a pot of coffee, stronger than usual, and gulped down half a cup before heading out to the barn, flashlight in hand. The beam cut through the pre-dawn darkness as Thomas approached the weathered structure. He paused at the door, steeling himself for what he might find. Death was no stranger to a farm, but this time felt different. He'd made a commitment to this animal, however impulsive it might have been. Relief washed over him when he saw the horse's side rising and falling with shallow breaths. It had shifted position slightly during the night, a good sign. Its eyes opened as Thomas approached, more alert than they had been the previous evening. "Well, good morning to you too," Thomas said softly. "Didn't expect to see those eyes looking so lively." He refreshed the water and prepared another gruel, this time adding a bit of molasses for calories and palatability. The horse seemed eager for the nourishment, making a more concerted effort to eat. Thomas stroked its neck gently, noticing for the first time that beneath the dirt and neglect, the coat had a reddish tint that suggested it might once have been a handsome chestnut. "You've got some fight in you, don't you?" he murmured. Thomas spent the next hour cleaning the stall and examining the horse more thoroughly in the strengthening daylight. It was a mare, he determined, probably around 10 years old based on her teeth. No obvious injuries beyond some scrapes and pressure sores from lying down too long. Just severe malnutrition and dehydration. What struck him most was the absence of fear in her eyes. Despite whatever hardship had brought her to that roadside, she showed a remarkable trust in human contact. The sound of tires on gravel announced Mike's arrival with the promised hay and the vet. Dr. Sarah Chen had been treating animals in the county for nearly 20 years. She was direct and no nonsense, but with a gentleness that put both animals and their owners at ease. "So this is our patient," she said, kneeling beside the horse with practiced efficiency. "You've got your work cut out for you, Thomas." The examination was thorough. Sarah checked vitals, drew blood, and assessed the mare's overall condition while Thomas and Mike stood by, ready to assist if needed. "She's in rough shape, but not as bad as I feared," Sarah finally concluded. "No major organ failure that I can detect, though we'll know more from the blood work. The biggest concerns are refeeding syndrome and her general weakness." "Refeeding syndrome?" Thomas asked. "When severely malnourished animals, or people for that matter, suddenly get normal amounts of food, it can cause dangerous metabolic shifts. We need to reintroduce nutrition very gradually." She handed Thomas a detailed feeding schedule and a list of supplements. "It'll be a slow process. Are you sure you're up for this?" Thomas nodded without hesitation. "I've got the time." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. They both knew what he wasn't saying, that time was about all he had left, with the farm slipping through his fingers. "I'll drop by in a few days to check on her progress," Sarah said, packing up her equipment. "Call me if anything changes before then." After the vet left, Mike helped Thomas set up a proper recovery area for the mare. They created a sling system with old fire hoses that would help support her weight when she was ready to stand for longer periods. "You thought of a name for her yet?" Mike asked as they worked. Thomas hadn't. Naming meant attachment, and attachment meant potential heartbreak. But looking at the mare's determined efforts to lift her head for water, a name came to him. "Grace," he said. "I think I'll call her Grace." "Fitting," Mike replied with a nod. "Because it'll take the grace of God to bring her back." The next 3 days fell into a routine of careful feeding, gentle grooming, and quiet conversation. Thomas found himself talking to Grace more than he'd spoken to anyone in months. He told her about the farm's history, about his late wife Margaret, about the children who had moved away to build lives in cities where opportunity still existed. Grace listened with pricked ears, her eyes following him as he moved around the barn. On the 4th day, Grace attempted to stand on her own. Thomas watched, heart in his throat, as she struggled to coordinate her weakened limbs. She managed to rise halfway before collapsing back to the straw with a frustrated whicker. "Easy now," Thomas soothed. "You'll get there. Small steps, remember." That evening, as Thomas prepared Grace's evening meal, he noticed a car coming up the drive, a sleek silver sedan that looked comically out of place among the dusty farm equipment. Emily stepped out, her city clothes a stark contrast to the rural setting. "Dad," she called, hurrying toward him. "Why haven't you been answering your phone? I've been worried sick." Thomas patted his pockets, realizing he'd left his cell phone in the house for days. "Sorry, Em. Been a bit preoccupied." He gestured toward the barn. "Come see why." Emily's expression shifted from concern to disbelief as she took in the sight of Grace and the makeshift equine hospital Thomas had created. "You adopted a horse? Now? Dad, have you lost your mind?" "Probably," Thomas admitted, "but I couldn't just leave her to die." "This is exactly what I worry about," Emily sighed. "You're struggling to keep the farm, and now you're taking on an expensive rescue project? How are you going to pay for all this?" "I'm managing," Thomas said defensively. "Sarah, Dr. Chen, is giving me a discount, and Mike's been helping with feed." Emily softened, seeing the determination in her father's eyes. "I just don't want you making things harder on yourself. You know Jason and I would be happy to have you come live with us. The kids would love having their grandfather around." Thomas shook his head. "This is my home, Em. I'll figure something out." They spoke for a while longer, carefully avoiding the subject of the impending foreclosure. Before leaving, Emily insisted on transferring money into his account for the horse's care, though they both knew it was for more than that. After she left, Thomas returned to Grace with a fresh bucket of water. "That was my daughter," he explained. "Thinks I'm crazy for taking you in. Maybe I am." Grace snorted softly as if in disagreement. "Well, at least you don't think so." Thomas chuckled. That's something. The following week saw small but steady improvements. Grace began standing for longer periods, her appetite increased, and the dull coat started to show hints of its former luster. Sarah's blood test results had come back showing no serious underlying conditions, just the expected imbalances from malnutrition. Thomas found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't since Margaret's passing 3 years ago. The simple goals of helping Grace recover gave his life a structure and purpose that had been missing. He tracked her progress meticulously in a notebook, celebrating each ounce gained and each minute spent standing. One morning, as Thomas entered the barn with Grace's breakfast, he found her standing on her own, alert and waiting for him. The sight stopped him in his tracks. "Well, look at you," he breathed. Grace nickered softly in response, taking a tentative step toward him. Her legs trembled with the effort, but she remained upright. For the first time since finding her, Thomas allowed himself to believe that Grace might fully recover. And with that thought came another, more troubling one. What would happen to her when the bank took the farm? Where would she go? Where would he go? The questions clouded his momentary joy, but Thomas pushed them aside. Today was for celebrating this small victory. Tomorrow's problems would keep until tomorrow. As August gave way to September, Grace's transformation continued to astonish everyone who saw her. The skeletal figure Thomas had found by the roadside was slowly being replaced by a horse with growing strength and vitality. Her coat, now regularly brushed, revealed itself to be a rich chestnut with a distinctive white star on her forehead. Sarah had estimated Grace to be around 10 years old, middle-aged for a horse, but with plenty of good years ahead if her recovery continued. Thomas expanded her diet gradually, following Sarah's instructions to the letter. He'd constructed a small paddock adjacent to the barn where Grace could exercise for short periods, building her muscle tone without overtaxing her still recovering body. The first time he led her outside, she had frozen at the threshold, blinking in the sunlight as if she'd forgotten what the world looked like. Then, with cautious steps, she'd ventured into the open air, her nostrils flaring to take in the sense of grass and earth. "That's it," Thomas had encouraged, holding the lead rope loosely. "It's all yours to explore." Despite his growing attachment to Grace, Thomas's financial situation continued to deteriorate. The most recent bank statement had shown a balance that wouldn't cover next month's property taxes, let alone make a dent in the mortgage payments. The foreclosure clock was ticking, with just over 4 months remaining before he would lose everything. Thomas sat at his kitchen table one evening, spreading out a collection of bills and notices. The numbers swam before his eyes, refusing to arrange themselves into anything resembling a solution. He'd already sold most of the farm equipment he wasn't actively using, along with his late wife's jewelry, keeping only her wedding ring, and his grandfather's collection of rare coins. Each sale had bought him a little time, but nothing substantial enough to alter the inevitable outcome. A knock at the door interrupted his gloomy calculations. Mike stood on the porch, holding a 6-pack of beer and wearing an expression that suggested he had news. "Thought you might use a drink," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Their friendship had long since moved past such formalities. Thomas cleared the bills from the table with a sweep of his arm, too tired to feel embarrassment at his financial exposure. "Always," he replied, taking the offered beer. Mike settled into a chair, eyeing the stack of papers that Thomas had moved to the counter. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Thomas admitted. "I'm looking at options, but they're pretty thin on the ground." Mike nodded, taking a long pull from his beer. "I might have something. Not a solution, but maybe a Band-Aid. Johnson over on County Line Road is looking for seasonal help with his harvest. Pays decent, and he knows you know what you're doing." Thomas considered this. Physical labor wasn't getting any easier at his age, but he wasn't ready for the rocking chair yet. "I appreciate it, Mike. I'll give him a call tomorrow." "How's the miracle horse doing?" Mike asked, changing the subject. Thomas couldn't help the smile that crept across his face. "See for yourself. He led Mike to the window that overlooked the paddock where Grace was enjoying the early evening air, moving with increasing confidence. Mike let out a low whistle. Would never have guessed she was the same animal. You've done good work there, Tom. She did most of it herself, Thomas said. Just needed a chance is all. Don't we all? Mike replied quietly, his eyes shifting momentarily to the pile of bills. The next morning, Thomas called Johnson and secured the harvest work. It would mean long days and sore muscles, but the paycheck would help keep the wolves from the door a little longer. Before heading out to check on Grace, he paused to listen to a voicemail from Emily. Dad, it's me. Just checking in. The kids are asking about visiting the farm before school gets too busy. Maybe next weekend? Call me back when you can. Love you. Thomas sighed. He hadn't told Emily just how precarious things had become. She knew about the foreclosure notice, but not how rapidly his resources were dwindling. The thought of his grandchildren visiting the farm for what might be the last time brought a lump to his throat. This land had been in the Morgan family for generations. The idea of it passing to strangers felt like a personal failure, a betrayal of his ancestors' hard work. Grace nickered softly as Thomas approached the paddock. She had taken to greeting him with increasing enthusiasm, sometimes trotting over when she spotted him. Today she seemed particularly energetic, prancing slightly with her head held higher than usual. Someone's feeling good this morning, Thomas observed, reaching over the fence to stroke her neck. Grace pushed her nose against his chest affectionately. Ready for some breakfast? After feeding Grace and cleaning her stall, Thomas took her for a longer walk than usual, circling the perimeter of what remained of his property. Most of the fields lay fallow now, too expensive to plant without guarantee of return. The drought had eased somewhat in recent weeks, with a few scattered showers providing minimal relief, but years of insufficient rainfall had taken their toll on the once fertile soil. Grace walked beside him calmly, occasionally stopping to investigate an interesting scent or plant. There was an intelligence in her eyes that Thomas found remarkable, an awareness that went beyond typical equine curiosity. When they reached the eastern boundary of the farm, where an ancient oak tree marked the corner of the property, Thomas paused to rest. My great-grandfather planted this tree, he told Grace, who was contentedly grazing on a patch of clover. Story goes he brought the acorn from the family farm in Tennessee when they moved west after the Civil War. My father used to say that as long as this tree stood, Morgans would work this land. He patted the rough bark thoughtfully. Guess the old oak will outlast us after all. Grace lifted her head suddenly, ears pricked forward, staring intently down the fence line. Thomas followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual. What is it, girl? See something I don't? Grace snorted, pawing at the ground with one hoof. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, she began walking deliberately along the fence line, stopping every few yards to look back at him, as if expecting him to follow. Intrigued, Thomas trailed after her. Grace led him about 50 yards to a section of fencing that had partially collapsed, hidden by overgrown brush. Thomas had been meaning to repair it for months, but hadn't prioritized it since he wasn't running livestock anymore. Good eye, he told Grace. I'll fix that next week. But Grace wasn't interested in the fence. She nosed at the ground persistently, then looked up at Thomas with what he could only describe as expectation. Curious, Thomas pushed aside the tall grass where she was indicating. The ground there seemed different somehow, less parched than the surrounding area. He knelt for a closer look and realized the soil was damp. Frowning, Thomas dug his fingers into the earth. Just a few inches down, he encountered mud, then water began to seep into the small hole he'd created. A spring. A natural spring on his property that he'd never known about. Well, I'll be damned, he breathed. Grace whickered softly, continuing to paw at the ground near the spring. Thomas sat back on his heels, mind racing. Water was life in farming country, especially during drought years. A reliable spring could change everything: irrigation possibilities, livestock sustainability, maybe even... He cut off that line of thinking. It was too late for new ventures. The bank would take the farm in a few months regardless. Yet he couldn't help but wonder at the timing of this discovery and at Grace's uncanny ability to lead him straight to it. "How did you know this was here?" he asked, not expecting an answer. Grace merely lowered her head to drink from the small puddle forming in the hole Thomas had dug, then raised her dripping muzzle to regard him steadily, water droplets catching the morning sunlight like tiny crystals. For the first time in months, Thomas felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. Perhaps it was foolish. A spring wouldn't magically produce the thousands needed to save the farm, but it was something new, something unexpected, something that had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. As they made their way back to the barn, Thomas found himself walking with a lighter step. He would call Mike, show him the spring. Maybe there was a way to leverage this discovery, small though it might seem in the grand scheme of things. Grace matched his pace, occasionally bumping his shoulder gently with her nose. Thomas reached up to stroke her neck, a gesture that had become automatic in their weeks together. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" he said softly. And for just a moment, as the morning sun bathed the farm in golden light, Thomas allowed himself to imagine a future where both he and Grace remained where they belonged. The discovery of the spring set in motion a series of events that Thomas could never have anticipated. Mike had brought out a water specialist from the County Agricultural Extension Office, a serious young woman named Natalie who spent an entire afternoon testing the spring's output and water quality. Her findings had left both men speechless. "This isn't just any spring, Mr. Morgan," she'd explained, reviewing the preliminary results on her tablet. "The flow rate is exceptional, especially for a drought period, and the mineral content." She shook her head in wonder. "It's remarkable. The calcium, magnesium, and trace element profile is similar to some of the high-end bottled waters on the market." Thomas had nodded, unsure what to make of this information. "Is that unusual?" "Extremely. Most groundwater in this region has higher levels of nitrates from agricultural runoff and less of the beneficial minerals. This source appears to be exceptionally pure and coming from deep aquifer systems that haven't been affected by surface contaminants." The week following this revelation had been a blur of activity. Thomas had started his harvest work for Johnson, spending long days operating machinery that left his back aching and his hands calloused. But in the evenings, he found renewed energy as he researched spring water markets and discussed possibilities with Mike. The idea of bottling the water seemed far-fetched at first. The startup costs alone would be prohibitive. But Mike had connections with a small regional bottling operation that might be interested in a partnership. Through it all, Grace continued to improve, gaining weight and strength. Thomas had begun to notice something peculiar about her behavior around the spring. Each time he brought her to that section of the property, she would drink deeply from the small pool they'd created, and then stand absolutely still, as if listening to something no one else could hear. After these sessions, she seemed even more energetic, her eyes brighter, her movements more fluid. "There's something about that water," Sarah remarked during her latest checkup visit. "I've never seen such rapid improvement in a case like hers." Thomas had to agree. Grace's recovery had accelerated beyond expectations. Her coat now gleamed with health, and muscle had begun to replace the sharp angles of her once protruding bones. But more than the physical changes, Thomas noticed a shift in her demeanor, an awareness that sometimes bordered on uncanny. One evening, as Thomas sat on the porch reviewing the tentative proposal Mike had drafted for the bottling company, Grace appeared at the fence line of the paddock. She stared intently at Thomas, then toward the road, repeatedly turning her head back and forth as if trying to direct his attention. "What is it, girl?" Thomas called, setting aside the papers. Grace whinnied loudly, continuing her odd behavior. Finally, Thomas stood with a sigh and walked over to the paddock. "You're getting demanding in your old age," he teased, scratching her forelock. No sooner had he reached the fence than the distant sound of a vehicle engine caught his attention. Moments later, Emily's car appeared at the end of the drive, much earlier than she had planned to arrive for her weekend visit with the children. Thomas stared at Grace in amazement. "How did you know they were coming?" Grace merely nudged his shoulder gently, as if to say, You'd better go greet them." The visit had been a welcome distraction from Thomas's financial worries. 10-year-old Aiden and 7-year-old Lily adored the farm, and they were particularly entranced by Grace. Thomas had supervised carefully as they fed her apple slices and stroked her gleaming coat. "She's so pretty, Grandpa," Lily had exclaimed. "Can I ride her?" "Not yet, sweetheart," Thomas had explained. "Grace is still recovering from being very sick. Maybe next time." That night, after the children were asleep, Emily had confronted Thomas at the kitchen table. "Dad, we need to talk about what happens when—" She had trailed off, unable to directly mention the foreclosure. "When I lose the farm," Thomas had finished for her. "I know, Em. I'm working on it." Emily's eyes had widened at his unexpected optimism. "Working on what exactly?" Thomas had explained about the spring, showing her the water analysis and Mike's draft proposal. Emily had listened skeptically at first, but as Thomas outlined the potential partnership with the regional bottling company, her expression had gradually shifted. "This could actually work," she'd admitted, reviewing the numbers. With her background in business, Emily could see the potential that Thomas had only vaguely grasped. "But the timeline is tight. Even if they agree immediately, getting operations up and running before the bank's deadline would be challenging." "I know," Thomas had acknowledged, "but it's the first real shot I've had." Now, a week after Emily's visit, Thomas stood by the spring with Grace at his side. He'd taken to bringing her here daily, both for the apparent benefits the water provided and for the quiet companionship as he cleared the area and built a proper collection basin under Mike's guidance. "The bottling rep is coming tomorrow," he told Grace, who was drinking deeply from the pool. "Mike says he's interested but cautious. Can't blame him. Investing in a nearly bankrupt farm isn't most people's idea of a sound business decision." Grace lifted her head, water droplets clinging to her whiskers, and nudged Thomas's pocket where he usually kept apple slices. "Greedy," he chuckled, producing the treat. "You know, for a horse that was at death's door 2 months ago, you've developed quite the appetite." As Grace munched contentedly, Thomas surveyed the work he'd done around the spring. The clearing was neat now, with a simple but effective system to channel the water into a large holding tank that Mike had helped him install. It wasn't fancy, but it demonstrated the spring's potential to the bottling company representative. Thomas's phone rang, Mike calling to confirm the meeting time for tomorrow. As they discussed details, Thomas noticed Grace wandering to the edge of the clearing, her ears pricked forward intently. Ending the call, he watched as she pawed at the ground in a spot about 20 yards from the main spring. "What have you found now?" he asked, making his way over to her. The ground where Grace was digging looked undisturbed, but when Thomas knelt to investigate, he found the soil there was also damp. Curious, he fetched a shovel from his truck and began to dig carefully. Less than 2 feet down, water began to pool in the hole. "Another spring?" he murmured in disbelief. By the time the sun began to set, Thomas had discovered 3 additional spring sources in the vicinity, all with the same clear, mineral-rich water. This wasn't just a single spring, it was a network, potentially increasing the property's water production capacity significantly. Heart racing with excitement, Thomas called Mike immediately. "You're not going to believe this," he began, then detailed his discovery. Mike let out a long, low whistle. "This changes everything, Tom. With multiple springs, you're talking about a much larger operation potential. The bottling company will definitely want to know about this before our meeting." After hanging up, Thomas turned to Grace, who stood calmly watching him, her expression almost smug. "You knew, didn't you?" he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Somehow you knew exactly where to look." Grace nickered softly, tossing her mane as if in affirmation. That night, Thomas could barely sleep, his mind filled with possibilities that hadn't existed just weeks ago. The discovery of multiple springs increased the property's value immensely, perhaps enough to negotiate with the bank for an extension or modified loan terms. The bottling partnership could provide ongoing income, allowing him to keep the farm, and perhaps even revitalize some of the agricultural operations. As dawn broke, Thomas made his way to the barn earlier than usual. Grace was already awake, standing alert in her stall as if she too understood the importance of the day ahead. "Morning, girl," Thomas greeted her, offering a carrot. "Big day today." After tending to Grace's needs, Thomas showered and put on his best flannel shirt and least-worn jeans. He rarely bothered with appearances these days, but today was different. Today could determine the future of Morgan Farm. The bottling company representative arrived precisely at 10, a trim man in his 40s named David Chen. Mike made the introductions, and they all climbed into Thomas's truck to visit the spring sites. "Impressive flow rate," David commented as Thomas demonstrated the mainspring's output. "And you say there are multiple sources?" Thomas led him to each of the additional springs he'd identified, explaining how Grace had essentially shown him where to look. David raised an eyebrow at this but focused on taking samples and making notes on his tablet. "The preliminary analysis looks promising," he said after reviewing the data. "Our company has been looking to expand our premium water line, and natural spring sources like this are exactly what we need to differentiate ourselves in the market." They returned to the house to discuss business terms. David laid out a proposal that exceeded Thomas's expectations, a 5-year contract with generous royalty terms, plus an upfront payment to develop the infrastructure needed to efficiently collect and transport the water. "We would want exclusive rights to the springs, of course," David explained. "But you would retain ownership of the land, and our operations would be minimally invasive to the rest of your property." Thomas felt a surge of hope as he reviewed the numbers. The upfront payment alone would be enough to negotiate with the bank, and the ongoing royalties would provide a steady income stream that could sustain the farm indefinitely. "I'd like to have my daughter look this over," Thomas said. "She has a better head for business than I do." "Of course," David agreed. "Take your time, but not too much time. We'd like to move forward quickly if possible." After David left, Mike clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "I told you there was something special about that spring, but I never imagined anything like this." Thomas nodded, still trying to process the sudden turn of events. "I need to call Emily." As Mike drove away, Thomas walked out to the paddock where Grace was enjoying the afternoon sun. She approached the fence as he drew near, her eyes seeming to ask a question. "It looks good," he told her, reaching out to stroke her neck. "Really good, and it's all because of you." Grace leaned into his touch, and Thomas could have sworn she understood every word. The contract with Clearwater Springs Bottling Company was signed 3 weeks later, after Emily had negotiated several favorable adjustments to the terms. The upfront development payment hit Thomas's account the following day, a sum substantial enough to bring his mortgage current and begin discussions with the bank about restructuring his remaining debt. What followed was a flurry of activity that transformed the sleepy Morgan Farm into a hive of industry. Surveyors mapped the spring network, environmental consultants conducted impact studies, and engineers designed a collection system that would preserve the natural beauty of the area while efficiently channeling the water to a small facility to be built on the least productive corner of the property. Thomas found himself busier than he'd been in years, dividing his time between overseeing the spring development, continuing his seasonal work for Johnson, and caring for Grace. The mare had become something of a local legend, with Mike spreading the story of how she had led Thomas to the springs that saved the farm. Sarah joked that Grace should be on the company's payroll as their water diviner. On a crisp October morning, Thomas sat on the porch with Emily, watching as construction equipment rumbled up the drive to begin work on the collection facility. Aiden and Lily were in the paddock with Grace, who had grown remarkably patient with their enthusiastic attention. "I still can't believe this is happening," Emily said, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands. "A month ago, you were preparing to lose everything, and now I'm in the spring water business," Thomas finished with a chuckle. "Life takes some strange turns." Emily studied her father's face, noting the new energy in his eyes, the decreased tension in his shoulders. "You seem different, Dad. Happier." Thomas nodded slowly. "I guess I am. Having a purpose again, a future to look forward to, it makes a difference." And having Grace doesn't hurt either, Emily observed. I've never seen you bond with an animal quite like this. Thomas watched as Grace gently nuzzled Lily's hair, making the little girl giggle. She's special, he said simply. I can't explain it, but she is. Later that afternoon, after Emily had taken the children back to the city, Thomas led Grace to the spring area. The construction crew had finished for the day, leaving behind stakes and markers that outlined where the collection system would be installed. Grace moved carefully around these new additions, inspecting them with what Thomas had come to recognize as her problem-solving expression. Don't worry, he assured her. They promised minimal disruption. The springs will still be accessible, just more organized. Grace snorted, as if expressing skepticism, then walked purposefully to the main spring. Thomas had noticed that her daily drinks from the spring water seemed to be part of a ritual for her now. She would approach slowly, lower her head, with almost ceremonial precision, and drink deeply before standing perfectly still for several minutes. Today, however, something different happened. As Grace stood in her customary meditation after drinking, Thomas noticed a strange shimmer in the air around her, almost like heat waves rising from hot pavement, but more pronounced, more colorful. He blinked, thinking it must be a trick of the late afternoon light filtering through the trees. But the effect intensified. For a brief moment, the shimmer coalesced into what looked like a gossamer veil surrounding Grace's body, pulsing with subtle colors that shifted from blue to green to purple. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the phenomenon vanished, leaving Thomas questioning his own vision. Grace turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the setting sun with an unusual clarity. She approached him slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate, and pressed her muzzle against his chest directly over his heart. An extraordinary warmth spread through Thomas's body from the point of contact, flowing outward to his limbs and upward to his head. With it came a profound sense of peace and well-being unlike anything he'd experienced before. The persistent ache in his lower back, a souvenir from decades of farm work, suddenly vanished. The stiffness in his hands that had been troubling him all week melted away. Thomas gasped, stepping back in shock. What was that? He whispered. Grace merely regarded him steadily, her expression unchanged. But Thomas felt different, lighter, more energetic, as if years had fallen away from his body. He flexed his hands experimentally, marveling at the absence of pain. On impulse, he bent to touch his toes, a movement that would normally send spasms through his back. Nothing. No pain, no stiffness, just a smooth, easy motion. This is impossible, he murmured. Grace nickered softly, then turned and walked calmly back toward the barn, leaving Thomas to follow in bewildered silence. That night, Thomas slept better than he had in years, waking refreshed just before dawn. The lack of pain continued, but more than that, he felt a vitality that had been missing for a long time. He dressed quickly and headed to the barn, eager to see if Grace showed any signs that might explain yesterday's strange occurrence. He found her waiting at the stall door, alert and expectant. She greeted him with a gentle nicker, accepting her breakfast with her usual enthusiasm. Nothing in her behavior suggested anything out of the ordinary, yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something profound had changed. As the morning progressed, Thomas noticed other small improvements in his condition. His vision seemed sharper. He could read the fine print on feed bags without his reading glasses. His hearing was more acute, picking up the distant sound of the construction crew arriving before he could see their vehicles. Even his sense of smell seemed enhanced, detecting subtle fragrances in the autumn air that he'd long since stopped noticing. When Sarah arrived for Grace's scheduled checkup that afternoon, she immediately commented on his appearance. "You look different, Thomas. Have you been doing something new? Working out, maybe?" Thomas hesitated, unsure how to explain what had happened. "Just getting more rest, I guess. How's our girl doing?" Sarah performed her examination with her usual thoroughness, checking Grace's vitals, teeth and hooves, then taking blood samples for ongoing monitoring. "Her recovery continues to amaze me," Sarah said, making notes on her tablet. I've never seen a horse bounce back from such severe malnutrition so completely. Her muscle tone, coat quality, eye clarity, all exceptional. If I hadn't seen her condition when you found her, I wouldn't believe she'd ever been ill. Thomas watched as Grace stood patiently for the examination, her eyes occasionally meeting his with what seemed like shared understanding. "There's something else," Sarah continued, frowning slightly as she reviewed her findings. Her blood work from last month showed some unusual markers, nothing concerning, just different from typical equine profiles. I'd like to run some additional tests if that's okay with you. "What kind of markers?" Thomas asked, suddenly alert. Sarah shrugged. "Elevated levels of certain enzymes, unusual mineral concentrations, things that normally might indicate a metabolic issue, but she shows no symptoms of any problems. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's as if her entire system is operating at an optimized level I've rarely seen." Thomas thought of the spring water Grace drank daily, the strange shimmering he'd witnessed, and the inexplicable healing he'd experienced. Were they connected? It seemed impossible, yet he couldn't dismiss the timing. "Run whatever tests you think necessary," he told Sarah. "I want to understand what's happening with her." After Sarah left, Thomas led Grace to the spring again. The construction crew had made significant progress, installing the first components of the collection system around 2 of the smaller springs. The main spring remained untouched for now, awaiting specialized equipment that would arrive the following week. Grace approached the spring with her usual deliberate gait. Thomas watched carefully as she drank, half expecting to see the strange shimmer again. Nothing unusual happened, but as Grace raised her head, she turned to look directly at Thomas and then back at the spring, repeating the motion several times. "You want me to drink too?" Thomas guessed, interpreting her behavior. Grace pawed the ground once, a gesture Thomas had come to recognize as affirmation. Thomas hesitated. He'd tasted the spring water before, of course, during the initial testing phase and when showing it to the bottling company representatives. But he'd never consumed it as part of Grace's ritual, never drunk directly from the source as she did. Feeling slightly foolish but deeply curious, Thomas knelt beside the spring and cupped his hands in the clear water. It felt unusually cool and somehow substantial, almost silky against his skin. He raised his hands to his lips and drank. The water tasted as pure and refreshing as he remembered, but as it slid down his throat, Thomas experienced a tingling sensation that spread throughout his body, similar to but less intense than what he'd felt when Grace touched him. A pleasant warmth settled in his chest, and his senses seemed to sharpen even further. When he stood, Thomas felt a strange connection to his surroundings. The trees, the earth beneath his feet, even the air he breathed, as if he could perceive energy flowing through all of it. The sensation was both exhilarating and disorienting. Grace watched him with what could only be described as satisfaction, her intelligent eyes following his movements as he tried to adjust to this new awareness. "What is this place?" Thomas whispered, more to himself than to Grace. "What are you?" Grace offered no answer beyond a gentle nudge of her nose against his arm, but Thomas felt certain now that there was far more to his rescue horse than met the eye. The springs she had led him to weren't just the salvation of his farm. They were something extraordinary, something perhaps beyond scientific explanation. As they walked back to the barn together, Thomas found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the natural world. One thing was clear. Grace had come into his life for a reason, and he sensed that her true purpose was only beginning to reveal itself. Word about the springs on Morgan Farm spread quickly through the county. What began as casual mentions among construction workers and suppliers soon evolved into a steady stream of local interest. Thomas found himself fielding calls and visits from neighbors curious about the bottling operation, and increasingly, about the miraculous recovery of the horse who had supposedly discovered the springs. Mike had unwittingly contributed to the growing folklore, sharing the story of Grace's remarkable intuition with friends at the feed store and local diner. By the time November arrived, embellished versions of the tale had taken root in community consciousness. Grace wasn't just a rescued horse who had led Thomas to water. She was a mystical creature with supernatural abilities, capable of sensing hidden treasures beneath the earth. Thomas did his best to downplay these exaggerations, but he couldn't deny the strange occurrences he'd witnessed firsthand. His health continued to improve in ways that defied explanation. The arthritis that had plagued his joints for years seemed to have vanished entirely. His stamina had increased to levels he hadn't experienced since his 30s. Even the reading glasses he'd relied on for the past decade now sat unused in a drawer. Sarah noticed these changes during her regular visits to check on Grace. At first, she attributed Thomas's improved condition to reduced stress and increased physical activity. But when she observed him easily lifting feed bags that had previously caused him to wince in pain, her professional curiosity was piqued. "Have you seen a doctor recently?" she asked one afternoon as they watched Grace trot around the paddock with graceful energy. Thomas shook his head. "Haven't needed to." Sarah studied him with narrowed eyes. "Your chronic back pain, the arthritis in your hands, these conditions don't just disappear, Thomas." "Maybe I got lucky," he replied with a shrug, unwilling to share his suspicions about the spring water's effects. The last thing he needed was scientific scrutiny of the springs before the bottling operation was fully established. Sarah wasn't easily deterred. "And what about these?" She held up the latest results of Grace's blood tests. "Her biochemistry continues to show anomalies I can't explain. Elevated levels of compounds that aren't typically found in equine physiology. Nothing harmful, quite the opposite. Her cellular regeneration rate is off the charts." Thomas pretended to examine the charts, though the technical data meant little to him. "But she's healthy, right?" "Extraordinarily so. That's what's so puzzling." Sarah tucked the papers back into her folder. "I'd like to publish a case study on her recovery, with your permission. It could be valuable to veterinary research." The request sent a jolt of alarm through Thomas. "Let's wait until she's been stable longer," he suggested, trying to sound casual. "No need to rush into anything." Sarah gave him a long look but didn't press the issue. As she was preparing to leave, a sleek black SUV with government plates pulled up beside her truck. A man and woman in business attire emerged, their expressions serious as they surveyed the property. "Mr. Morgan?" the woman called, approaching with an outstretched hand. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Vance from the U.S. Geological Survey. This is my colleague, Dr. James Whitmore. We understand you've discovered some unique spring formations on your property." Thomas shook their hands reluctantly, a sense of unease settling in his stomach. "That's right. We're developing them for commercial bottling." "So we've heard," Dr. Vance replied with a tight smile. "Our department monitors significant hydrological discoveries, especially in drought-affected regions. We'd like to take some samples for our records, if you don't mind." Before Thomas could respond, Sarah interjected. "I was just leaving. Thomas, call me if you need anything." The meaningful look she gave him suggested she sensed his discomfort. Once Sarah had driven away, Thomas led the geologists toward the spring area, his mind racing. The construction site was active today, with workers installing pumping equipment around the secondary springs. The main spring, however, remained relatively untouched. Thomas had insisted on preserving its natural formation as much as possible, much to the bottling company's confusion. "Impressive operation, Dr. Whitmore commented, noting the activity. "Clearwater Springs is moving quickly." "You know about the partnership?" Thomas asked, surprised. "We make it our business to stay informed about water resource developments," Dr. Vance explained, "especially ones that appear so suddenly in areas previously mapped as having limited groundwater access." Something in her tone made Thomas uncomfortable. "The springs were always here," he said defensively. "They were just hidden." "Of course," Dr. Whitmore agreed, though his expression remained skeptical. "Nature is full of surprises." They reached the main spring, which bubbled serenely in its natural basin. The water caught the midday sun, seeming to shimmer with an inner light that Thomas had come to recognize as unique to these particular springs. Dr. Vance knelt beside the water, removing sampling equipment from her case. "How exactly did you discover this primary source, Mr. Morgan?" Thomas hesitated, unwilling to mention Grace's role. "Just lucky, I guess. Was clearing brush in this area and noticed the ground was damp." Dr. Whitmore made notes on a tablet while Dr. Vance collected water samples in various containers, labeling each meticulously. They worked with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this many times before. The preliminary analysis provided by Clearwater indicated unusual mineral composition, Dr. Vance commented. "High concentrations of trace elements typically found only in deep aquifer systems or certain volcanic regions." "Is that a problem?" Thomas asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Not a problem," Dr. Whitmore assured him. "Just scientifically interesting. This area isn't known for its mineral springs." As they continued their work, Thomas noticed Grace watching from the tree line at the edge of the clearing. She stood perfectly still, her ears forward, observing the scientists with what appeared to be wary interest. When Dr. Vance approached a particular section of the spring, the exact spot where Thomas had witnessed the strange shimmering effect, Grace stepped forward, nickering softly. Dr. Vance looked up, noticing the horse for the first time. "Beautiful animal," she remarked. "Yours?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "That's Grace." "She seems interested in what we're doing," Dr. Whitmore observed as Grace continued to advance slowly toward them. Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness. "She's curious by nature." Grace stopped at the edge of the spring, her eyes fixed on the sample containers in Dr. Vance's hands. A tense silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the gentle gurgling of the spring and the distant sounds of construction. Then, to Thomas's amazement, Grace deliberately placed one hoof in the water and pawed gently, creating ripples that spread outward in perfect concentric circles. The water began to glow faintly, a subtle luminescence that might have been dismissed as a trick of the light if not for the sharp intake of breath from both scientists. The glow intensified briefly, then faded as the ripples subsided. "Did you see that?" Dr. Whitmore whispered, his professional detachment momentarily forgotten. Dr. Vance nodded slowly, her eyes wide. "Some kind of bioluminescent reaction, perhaps? Or mineral phosphorescence activated by agitation?" Grace withdrew her hoof and shook it delicately, then turned and walked away, disappearing back into the trees as calmly as she had appeared. The scientists exchanged glances, then quickly collected additional samples from the exact spot Grace had disturbed. Their movements were more hurried now, their earlier casual demeanor replaced by intense scientific focus. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Vance said finally, securing the last sample in her case, "has anything like that happened before?" Thomas feigned surprise. "Like what? The water catching the sunlight?" Dr. Whitmore gave him a penetrating look. "That was more than a sunlight reflection. You must have noticed." "I'm not a scientist," Thomas replied with a shrug. "These springs have always seemed special to me, but I wouldn't know what to look for in terms of unusual properties." Neither scientist appeared convinced by his nonchalance, but they didn't press further. As they packed up their equipment, Dr. Vance handed Thomas a business card. "We'll be analyzing these samples thoroughly," she said. "You can expect us to follow up within the week. In the meantime, if you observe any other unusual phenomena, please contact me directly." After the geologists departed, Thomas hurried back to the barn, where he found Grace in her stall, calmly munching hay as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He leaned against the stall door, studying her with a mixture of awe and concern. "What did you do back there?" he asked softly. "And why?" Grace lifted her head, regarding him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond his comprehension. She offered no answer, of course, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had been deliberate, a conscious choice to reveal something to the scientists, or perhaps to him. That evening, Thomas called Emily to share what had happened. She listened without interruption, having grown accustomed to the increasingly strange reports from the farm. "Do you think these government scientists could cause problems for the bottling operation?" she asked when he'd finished. I don't know, Thomas admitted. They seemed more interested than concerned, but still, what about Grace? Do you think she's safe? The question caught Thomas off guard. He hadn't considered that Grace might be at risk, but now the thought sent a chill through him. If her connection to the springs became widely known, if people began to believe she was somehow responsible for the water's unusual properties. I'll protect her, he said firmly. Whatever happens. After hanging up, Thomas sat on the porch, watching as darkness settled over the farm. The distant lights of the construction site glowed faintly, a reminder of how quickly things were changing. In just a few months, Morgan Farm had transformed from a failing agricultural operation to the site of what promised to be a lucrative water business. His financial problems were resolving, his health was better than it had been in decades, and yet Thomas couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The springs were more than just water sources. He was certain of that now. And Grace was more than just an ordinary horse who had happened to lead him to them. There was a connection between them that defied rational explanation, a mystery that was gradually unfolding before his eyes. As if summoned by his thoughts, a soft nickering came from the direction of the paddock. Thomas looked up to see Grace standing at the fence, her pale form ghostly in the moonlight. She pawed the ground once, then turned her head toward the spring area, an unmistakable invitation. Without hesitation, Thomas rose and followed. Whatever was happening, whatever Grace was trying to show him, he was ready to see it through. The night air carried a hint of frost as Thomas followed Grace toward the springs. The quarter moon cast just enough light to navigate the familiar path, though Thomas noticed he could see better in the darkness than he once could. Another unexplained improvement since he'd begun drinking the spring water. Grace moved with purpose, her pale coat seeming to gather what little moonlight there was. When they reached the main spring, she stopped and waited for Thomas to catch up. The construction equipment stood silent around the secondary springs, dark silhouettes against the night sky. The main spring, however, seemed to emit a faint luminescence, the water glowing with the same subtle light Thomas had witnessed earlier. "What is this place, Grace?" he whispered, kneeling beside the water. "What are you trying to show me?" Grace stepped forward, placing her hoof in the water as she had done in front of the scientists. This time, however, the effect was far more dramatic. The water's glow intensified, spreading outward from the point of contact in spiraling patterns that resembled constellations. The light rose from the surface, forming a shimmering column that enveloped both Grace and Thomas in its gentle radiance. Within this column of light, Thomas experienced a series of vivid impressions, not quite visions, but sensations and knowledge flowing directly into his consciousness. He understood suddenly that the springs weren't merely water sources but nexus points where the Earth's vital energy gathered and concentrated. These places had been sacred to indigenous peoples long before European settlers claimed the land. The water didn't just hydrate the body, it harmonized and amplified life energy. And Grace, Thomas perceived with startling clarity that she was a guardian of sorts, drawn to these springs by an ancient connection. She had not randomly appeared on that roadside. She had been sent there, weakened but determined to find someone who could protect the springs from exploitation. As abruptly as it had formed, the column of light dissipated, leaving Thomas breathless and disoriented. Grace withdrew her hoof from the water and nuzzled his shoulder gently, as if to steady him. "You chose me," Thomas murmured, reaching up to stroke her neck. "But why? I'm just a failing farmer who can barely save his own land." Grace's eyes seemed to hold an answer he couldn't quite grasp, a wisdom beyond words. Thomas sat beside the spring for a long time, trying to process what he had experienced. By the time they returned to the barn, dawn was breaking on the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold. Thomas moved through his morning chores mechanically, his mind still swirling with the night's revelations. He was so distracted that he didn't notice the black SUV pulling up until the doors slammed shut. Dr. Vance and Dr. Whitmore had returned, accompanied by a third person, a stern-looking man in a dark suit who surveyed the farm with calculating eyes. "Mr. Morgan," Dr. Vance called, approaching with forced cheerfulness. Sorry to drop in unannounced, but our preliminary findings were so remarkable that we felt an immediate follow-up was necessary. Thomas nodded warily, wiping his hands on his jeans. No problem. Who's your friend? This is Mr. Lawrence Blackwood from the Department of Energy's Special Resources Division, Dr. Whitmore explained. He specializes in unusual natural phenomena. Blackwood stepped forward, offering a handshake that was firm to the point of discomfort. Mr. Morgan, I understand you've discovered something quite extraordinary on your property. Just some springs with good mineral content, Thomas replied, deliberately understating the situation. Nothing that warrants government interest, surely. Blackwood's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Our analysis suggests otherwise. The water samples Dr. Vance collected show properties that aren't easily explained by conventional geology. We'd like to conduct a more thorough investigation, with your cooperation, of course. The request sounded polite, but Thomas sensed an underlying assumption that his cooperation was expected rather than requested. He thought of the commercialization already underway, the contracts signed, the financial salvation the springs represented. I'm not sure what you're looking for, Thomas said carefully. But this land is private property, and the springs are already committed to a commercial partnership. We're aware of your arrangement with Clearwater Springs, Blackwood replied smoothly. However, when natural resources of potential national significance are discovered, the federal government has certain prerogatives regarding research access. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. I'd like to consult with my lawyer before agreeing to anything further. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. Of course. But I should mention that our department has the authority to designate areas for scientific study under certain circumstances, which could temporarily suspend commercial development. The threat was clear, and Thomas fought to keep his expression neutral. Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. Grace had emerged from the barn and was trotting toward them, her movements fluid and powerful, showing no trace of her former weakness. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he watched the horse approach. Is this the animal that reportedly discovered the springs? That's Grace, Thomas confirmed, moving protectively toward her as she came to a stop beside him. And she's just a horse I rescued a few months back. Fascinating specimen, Blackwood murmured, studying Grace with uncomfortable intensity. Dr. Vance mentioned some unusual behavior yesterday. Something about the water responding to the animal's touch? Thomas shrugged. Horses paw at water sometimes. It's normal behavior. Perhaps, Blackwood conceded, though his tone suggested skepticism. Still, I'd be interested in having one of our zoologists examine her. Purely routine, of course. The suggestion sent a surge of alarm through Thomas. That won't be necessary. She has her own vet who monitors her health. Blackwood seemed about to insist when his phone buzzed. He checked the screen and frowned. Excuse me a moment. He stepped away to take the call, leaving Thomas with the two scientists. Your horse does seem remarkable, Dr. Vance commented, her eyes tracking Grace's movements as the mare circled restlessly. Her recovery must have been extraordinary, given what you've told us about her condition when you found her. She's a fighter, Thomas replied simply. Dr. Whitmore cleared his throat. Mr. Morgan, I feel I should tell you, the samples we collected yesterday, they're unlike anything in our database. The molecular structure of the water itself appears to be arranged in patterns that shouldn't naturally occur, and the energy readings… James, Dr. Vance cut in sharply, casting a warning glance at her colleague. Dr. Whitmore pressed his lips together, clearly having said more than he was authorized to share. Thomas filed the partial information away, his concern deepening. Whatever the government had discovered in the spring water, it was unusual enough to trigger this level of interest and potential interference. Blackwood returned, his expression composed but with a new intensity in his gaze. Mr. Morgan, I've just received authorization to establish a temporary research perimeter around the spring sites. A team will be arriving this afternoon to set up equipment and begin a comprehensive analysis. Now wait just a minute, Thomas protested. You can't just take over my property. I assure you, this is perfectly legal, Blackwood interrupted, producing an official-looking document from his breast pocket. This authorization allows us access for scientific purposes under the Critical Natural Resources Act. Your commercial activities will need to be temporarily suspended, but you'll be compensated for any financial impact. Thomas stared at the paper, anger building in his chest. And if I refuse? That would be unwise, Blackwood replied, his voice hardening. Obstruction of a federal investigation carries significant penalties. Before Thomas could respond, Grace suddenly reared up, her front hooves pawing the air. She let out a shrill whinny that startled all four humans, then bolted toward the spring area at full gallop. "What the?" Blackwood began, but Thomas was already running after Grace, a sense of urgency propelling him forward. By the time Thomas reached the springs, Grace was standing at the edge of the main basin, her posture alert and defensive. As the others caught up, she pawed at the ground, her message clear to Thomas, if not to the government officials. This place needed protection. "Remarkable animal," Blackwood commented, watching Grace with calculating eyes. "Almost seems to understand what we're discussing." "She's protective of her home," Thomas replied, moving to stand beside Grace. "As am I." Blackwood studied them both for a long moment, then sighed. "Mr. Morgan, I understand your reluctance, but this investigation will proceed, with or without your willing cooperation. I suggest you consider the benefits of working with us rather than against us." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I'll need to speak with my lawyer and the bottling company representatives before you bring any equipment onto my property. That's non-negotiable." After a tense silence, Blackwood nodded. "You have until tomorrow morning. I'll expect your answer by 9 a.m. He handed Thomas a business card. "Call this number when you're ready to discuss terms." With that, the three government representatives departed, leaving Thomas alone with Grace beside the spring. As their vehicle disappeared down the driveway, Thomas felt a wave of despair wash over him. Just when it seemed the farm was saved, a new threat had emerged, one that might be impossible to fight. Grace nudged his hand gently, drawing his attention back to the present. The mayor's eyes held a steadiness that calmed Thomas's racing thoughts. Whatever was happening, whatever these springs truly were, Grace seemed to understand their significance better than anyone. "What do we do now, girl?" Thomas asked softly. Grace turned toward the spring, then back to Thomas, her meaning clear even without words. "Protect the water." Thomas called Mike immediately, explaining the situation in hurried tones. Mike arrived within the hour, bringing with him a local attorney named Patricia Alvarez, who specialized in property rights and environmental law. They gathered at Thomas's kitchen table, reviewing the documentation Blackwood had provided. "It's legitimate," Patricia confirmed grimly after examining the authorization. "This act was designed for situations where unique natural resources might have national security implications. It's rarely invoked, but when it is, landowners have limited recourse." "So they can just take over my springs?" Thomas asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "Not permanently," Patricia clarified. "The authorization allows for temporary access for research purposes, but temporary can be stretched considerably if they find what they're looking for." "And what exactly are they looking for?" Mike wondered. "What could be so special about spring water that the Department of Energy gets involved?" Thomas thought of Dr. Whitmore's slip about unusual molecular structures and energy readings, but kept his own experiences to himself. Even to his closest friends, the full truth seemed too fantastic to share. "Whatever it is," Patricia said, "they're moving quickly, which suggests significant interest at high levels. Our best strategy is to negotiate terms that protect your rights as much as possible while appearing cooperative." Thomas nodded slowly, though inwardly he felt anything but cooperative. The springs were special, sacred even, and Grace had chosen him to protect them. Allowing government scientists to poke and prod, potentially exploiting whatever power the springs contained, felt like a betrayal of that trust. As if sensing his thoughts, Grace appeared at the kitchen window, her intelligent eyes fixed on Thomas. In that moment, he knew what he had to do. "Thank you both for your help," he said, rising from the table. "I need some time to think this through. Patricia, can you draft something that buys us more time while protecting our interests?" "I'll do my best," she promised. "But Thomas, don't do anything rash. These are federal authorities we're dealing with." After they left, Thomas walked out to the paddock where Grace waited. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farm, and in the distance, the construction equipment at the springs stood idle, a reminder of plans now in jeopardy. "They'll be back tomorrow," Thomas told Grace quietly, "and they won't stop until they've taken samples of everything, including you. I can't let that happen." Grace nickered softly, pressing her muzzle against Thomas's chest. That familiar warmth spread through him again, but this time it brought clarity rather than physical healing. Thomas knew with sudden certainty what needed to be done. Under cover of darkness, he would move Grace to Emily's property outside the city, where she would be safe from government interest. And then he would return to face whatever came next, alone if necessary, but with a plan to protect the springs that had become his unexpected salvation. Darkness had settled over the farm when Thomas finished loading the last of Grace's supplies into his truck. He had called Emily earlier, explaining only that he needed to board Grace with her temporarily due to complications with the government inspection. Emily, accustomed to her father's increasing reticence about the springs, had agreed without pressing for details. The horse trailer was hitched and ready, but as Thomas approached the barn to fetch Grace, he found her standing stubbornly at the entrance, refusing to move toward the trailer. Each time he tried to lead her forward, she planted her hooves and pulled back against the lead rope. "Come on, girl," Thomas urged, his voice low and urgent. "We don't have much time. You'll be safer with Emily." Grace snorted and tossed her head, then deliberately turned and walked back into the barn. Confused and increasingly frustrated, Thomas followed. Inside, Grace stood beside her stall, but instead of entering it, she pawed at the ground and looked pointedly at Thomas. "What are you trying to tell me?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect she had no intention of leaving the farm. Grace moved to the barn door and gazed out toward the springs, then back at Thomas. The message was unmistakable. She wouldn't abandon her post. Thomas sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "You're as stubborn as I am, you know that? But they'll want to study you, maybe even take you to some government facility if they figure out your connection to the springs." Grace merely regarded him steadily, her resolve apparent in every line of her body. After a long moment, Thomas nodded in resignation. "All right," he conceded. "We stay and face this together. But we do it my way." He unhitched the trailer and returned the supplies to the barn, his mind racing to formulate a new plan. If they couldn't evade the government's interest, perhaps they could channel it in a direction that would protect both Grace and the springs. Thomas spent the remainder of the night making calls, first to Patricia to revise their legal strategy, then to David Chen at Clearwater Springs, and finally to Emily, whose business acumen he trusted implicitly. By dawn, he had cobbled together a risky but potentially viable approach. The government team arrived precisely at 9, a convoy of 3 vehicles loaded with scientific equipment and personnel. Blackwood led the procession, his expression suggesting he expected resistance. Instead, he found Thomas waiting calmly on the porch, Grace standing beside him like a sentinel. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," Blackwood greeted him, clearly surprised by the peaceful reception. "I trust you've had time to consider our discussion?" "I have," Thomas replied evenly. "And I have a counter-proposal." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Morgan. The authorization grants you access for scientific research," Thomas interrupted. "It doesn't give you carte blanche to disrupt legitimate business operations or to remove samples without oversight." He gestured to a woman standing nearby. "This is Patricia Alvarez, my attorney. She's prepared documentation outlining the legal parameters of your investigation on private property." Patricia stepped forward, handing Blackwood a folder. "You'll find everything in order, Mr. Blackwood. We're not obstructing your research, merely establishing a framework that respects Mr. Morgan's rights and the commercial interests already in place. Blackwood scanned the documents, his frown deepening. This significantly restricts our activities. It does nothing of the sort, Patricia countered smoothly. It simply requires transparency, shared data, and mutual consent for any actions that might permanently alter the springs or surrounding property. While Blackwood continued reviewing the paperwork, Thomas nodded to a man who had just pulled up in a company car emblazoned with the Clearwater Springs logo. "This is David Chen, VP of Operations for Clearwater," Thomas explained. "Since they have contractual rights to the springs, they're legally entitled to monitor any research that might impact their investment." David approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Blackwood, we're eager to cooperate with your team. In fact, our company has extensive data on the springs that might complement your research efforts." Blackwood looked from David to Thomas to Patricia, clearly reassessing the situation. What he had expected to be a straightforward government takeover had transformed into a complex negotiation with multiple stakeholders. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll work within these parameters, for now. But I want it understood that if we discover anything with national security implications, all prior agreements become subordinate to federal interests." "Understood," Thomas agreed, knowing it was the best compromise he could hope for. "Your team can set up near the secondary springs. The main spring will remain accessible but undisturbed except for non-invasive sampling." Blackwood gave a curt nod, then turned to direct his team in unloading their equipment. As the scientists began establishing their temporary research station, Thomas led Grace back to the barn, away from their curious glances. "That bought us some time," he told her quietly, "but we're not out of the woods yet." Throughout the day, Thomas watched as the government team installed monitoring devices around the springs. They worked with military efficiency, cataloging every aspect of the area: soil composition, radiation levels, electromagnetic readings, and countless water samples. Two scientists in particular seemed assigned to observe Grace whenever she was visible, taking notes on her behavior with unsettling interest. By late afternoon, the preliminary data had begun flowing in, and Thomas noticed a perceptible shift in the team's energy. Hushed conversations and urgent phone calls suggested they had found something significant. Blackwood spent nearly an hour in his vehicle, speaking with someone Thomas presumed was a superior, his gestures becoming increasingly animated. When Blackwood finally emerged, his expression was resolute. He strode directly to Thomas, who was helping David review the bottling system specifications to ensure the government equipment wouldn't interfere with the planned infrastructure. "Mr. Morgan," Blackwood said without preamble, "we need to discuss your horse." Thomas straightened, instinctively tensing. "What about her?" "Our initial readings show unusual energy patterns concentrated around both the main spring and the animal. Too similar to be coincidental." Blackwood fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. "I think you know more than you've told us about the connection between them." "Grace is just a horse I rescued," Thomas maintained, though he could hear the hollowness in his own words. "A horse that led you to previously undiscovered springs with extraordinary properties," Blackwood countered. "A horse that exhibits behavior patterns far outside normal equine parameters. A horse whose blood chemistry, according to veterinary records we've obtained, shows compounds not documented in any known species." Thomas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. They had accessed Sarah's medical records on Grace without permission, a clear invasion of privacy that demonstrated how far they were willing to go. "What exactly are you asking?" Thomas demanded, abandoning the pretense of ignorance. "We need to conduct a full examination of the animal in a controlled setting," Blackwood stated. "Preferably at our facility in Colorado where we have specialized equipment." "Absolutely not," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Grace stays here." Blackwood's expression hardened. "This isn't a request, Mr. Morgan. The authorization covers all relevant resources connected to the springs, which clearly includes the animal." "She has a name," Thomas snapped, his anger rising, "and she's not a resource to be studied and exploited. She's a living being under my protection." "Your attachment is understandable," Blackwood said, his tone softening slightly. "But you must see the bigger picture. Whatever is happening here could have profound implications for science, medicine, perhaps even national security. The animal, Grace, appears to be a key to understanding it all." Before Thomas could respond, a commotion erupted near the mainspring. One of the scientists had apparently attempted to install a collection device directly in the spring basin, despite the agreed-upon restrictions. The water had responded with a dramatic display of luminescence that sent the researcher stumbling backward in shock. Blackwood immediately hurried toward the disturbance, leaving Thomas momentarily forgotten. Seizing the opportunity, Thomas slipped away to the barn where Grace was safely stabled. He found her alert and restless, sensing the tension even from a distance. "They want to take you," Thomas told her, his voice breaking slightly. "Study you in some laboratory. I won't let that happen, but I don't know how to stop them if they push hard enough." Grace's eyes met his, calm and knowing. She nudged his pocket where he kept the small vial of spring water he had taken to carrying with him. Thomas withdrew it, the clear liquid catching the light filtering through the barn windows. "The water," he murmured. "It's always been about the water." An idea began to form, risky, potentially dangerous, but perhaps their only option. If the government was determined to understand the spring's properties, maybe it was time to demonstrate them in a way that couldn't be ignored or exploited. Thomas was still formulating his plan when Patricia arrived at the barn, her expression grave. "They're escalating things," she reported. "Blackwood's filing for an emergency extension of authority that would allow them to remove Grace for study. I can fight it, but these federal authorizations are difficult to overcome in court." "How long do we have?" Thomas asked. "The paperwork takes time. 2 days, maybe 3 before they could legally take her." Patricia hesitated, then added, "But Thomas, if they're determined enough, they might not wait for the full authorization. I've seen it before. Act first, deal with the legal consequences later when national security is invoked." Thomas nodded grimly. "Then we need to move quickly. Can you get something ready for me?" He outlined what he needed, and Patricia listened with widening eyes. "That's a bold strategy," she said when he finished. "Potentially very effective, but with significant risks." "I'm out of better options," Thomas replied. "And Grace deserves a chance to live freely, not as a government test subject." After Patricia left to prepare the necessary documents, Thomas returned to the spring area where the government team was still working, now with increased urgency following the unexplained luminescence event. Blackwood was on his phone again, his back turned to the activity around him. David approached Thomas, concern evident in his expression. "They're going well beyond observational research now," he said quietly. "This could jeopardize our entire operation." "I know," Thomas acknowledged, "but I have a plan that might protect everyone's interests. I need you to arrange a meeting tomorrow. Your company executives, the government team, and local press." "Press?" David repeated, surprised. "Blackwood won't want media attention." "Exactly," Thomas said, "which is why we need it. Trust me on this, David. It's our best play." After a moment's hesitation, David nodded. "I'll make the calls, but whatever you're planning, I hope it works. There's a lot at stake here." As dusk approached, the government team reluctantly suspended their activities, setting up powerful lights to continue first thing in the morning. Blackwood informed Thomas that they would be posting security personnel overnight, ostensibly to protect the equipment, but Thomas suspected it was equally to ensure nothing happened to the Springs or Grace in their absence. Once relative privacy was restored, Thomas led Grace to the main spring under the watchful eye of a single security officer who maintained a respectful distance. The evening air was cold and still, the water's surface reflecting the emerging stars above. "Tomorrow will change everything," Thomas told Grace softly, stroking her neck. One way or another, Grace dipped her muzzle to the water, drinking deeply as she had done so many times before. When she raised her head, droplets clung to her whiskers, catching the moonlight like tiny diamonds. She turned to Thomas and pressed her forehead against his chest in a gesture of complete trust. In that moment, Thomas knew with absolute certainty that his plan, however risky, was the right course of action. The springs had brought Grace into his life for a reason. Now it was time to fulfill whatever purpose had drawn them together in this unlikely partnership. As they walked back to the barn, the security officer watching curiously from afar, Thomas felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Tomorrow would bring confrontation and potential sacrifice, but also the possibility of a resolution that honored the remarkable bond between a desperate farmer, a mysterious horse, and the extraordinary springs that had changed both their lives forever. Dawn broke crisp and clear over Morgan Farm, the November sun casting long shadows across the frost-covered ground. Thomas had slept little, rising before first light to check on Grace and finalize preparations for the day ahead. The mare seemed unusually calm, as if she understood the significance of what was to come and trusted in Thomas's plan. By mid-morning, the farm had transformed into an impromptu gathering place. David had delivered on his promise, bringing 3 Clearwater Springs executives who stood in a tight cluster near the bottling infrastructure, their expressions betraying concern over the government presence. Blackwood had clearly been blindsided by the meeting request, but had grudgingly agreed, perhaps hoping to maintain the illusion of cooperation while his team continued their intensive data collection. The wild card, and Thomas's greatest gamble, was the local press. Patricia had exceeded expectations, contacting not only the county newspaper but also a regional television station and a respected environmental journalist with a significant online following. They arrived in a small convoy, cameras and recording equipment in tow, creating immediate tension among the government researchers who began hastily covering certain instruments and displays. Blackwood intercepted Thomas as he emerged from the house, his face tight with barely controlled anger. "What is this circus, Morgan? Public media has no place in a sensitive scientific investigation." "This is still my property," Thomas replied calmly. "And there's public interest in what happens here. Transparency serves everyone's interests, doesn't it?" Before Blackwood could respond, Emily's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, professional in a crisp business suit, followed by Mike and, to Thomas's surprise, Sarah Chen. The small crowd had grown larger than even Thomas had anticipated, creating exactly the public scrutiny he had hoped for. "Shall we begin?" Thomas suggested, gesturing toward a cleared area near the main spring where he had set up a simple podium using an old barrel and a plank of wood. Blackwood's jaw worked silently for a moment before he gave a curt nod. "This changes nothing about our authority here." As the assembled group gathered around the makeshift podium, Thomas led Grace from the barn. The mare walked beside him with dignified poise, her rehabilitated form a stark contrast to the emaciated animal he had found by the roadside months ago. Several cameras turned to capture her approach, and Thomas heard murmured comments about her beauty and the remarkable story of her recovery. With Grace standing calmly beside him, Thomas addressed the gathered crowd. "Thank you all for coming. I've asked you here because what's happening on this farm affects many interests: private, commercial, governmental, and perhaps most importantly, environmental." He gestured toward the springs where government equipment now surrounded the once pristine area. 3 months ago, I found Grace near death on the side of the road. In nursing her back to health, I discovered something extraordinary. She led me to natural springs on my property that I never knew existed. Springs with unusual properties that have attracted both commercial interest and government attention. Thomas glanced at Blackwood, whose expression remained impassive. "Initially, I saw these springs as the financial salvation of my farm, which was facing foreclosure. Clearwater Springs Bottling Company recognized the water's exceptional quality and offered a partnership that would save my property while bringing a premium product to market. The Clearwater executives nodded in agreement, clearly pleased with this framing of their involvement. However," Thomas continued, "recent developments have revealed that these springs may be more significant than any of us initially understood. The government team led by Mr. Blackwood has discovered properties in the water that have scientific implications beyond ordinary commercial use." Blackwood stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the narrative. Mr. Morgan is referring to preliminary findings that remain classified pending further investigation. What I can say is that the Department of Energy has authorized a comprehensive study of these springs under the Critical Natural Resources Act due to their potential significance. The environmental journalist raised her hand. Can you elaborate on what makes these springs so special that they warrant federal intervention? Blackwood hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question. That remains classified at this time. Perhaps I can help, Thomas interjected. He removed the small vial of spring water from his pocket, holding it up for all to see. This water has remarkable properties I've experienced firsthand. He turned to Sarah, who stepped forward at his nod. Dr. Chen, you've been monitoring Grace's recovery and my own health changes. Would you share your observations? Sarah cleared her throat, professional despite the unusual circumstances. As Grace's veterinarian, I can confirm that her recovery from severe malnutrition has been unprecedented in my 20 years of practice. Her cellular regeneration rates, immune response, and overall vitality exceed anything in veterinary literature. Similarly, Mr. Morgan has demonstrated health improvements that are difficult to explain through conventional medicine. The journalists scribbled notes furiously, and Thomas could see Blackwood growing increasingly tense as the conversation veered into territory he had hoped to keep controlled. The water from these springs appears to have remarkable healing properties, Thomas continued, properties that could benefit many people if properly understood and shared. But there's a delicate balance to be maintained between scientific discovery, commercial use, and protecting something truly special from exploitation. He paused, making eye contact with several members of the audience. Which brings me to the real purpose of this gathering. With the help of my attorney, I've established the Morgan Springs Conservation Trust. Patricia stepped forward, distributing copies of legal documents to key individuals, including Blackwood and the Clearwater executives. This trust, Thomas explained, places the springs and surrounding 5 acres under permanent environmental protection. Development is restricted to minimally invasive collection systems. Scientific research must be conducted with transparency and public oversight, and a portion of all commercial proceeds will fund ongoing conservation efforts. The Clearwater representatives huddled together, reviewing the documents with surprised expressions. Blackwood snatched his copy from Patricia, scanning it with growing disbelief. This is an attempt to obstruct a federal investigation, he protested. You can't unilaterally restrict government access to resources of national interest. Actually, he can, Patricia countered smoothly. The trust was finalized and registered yesterday, before your expanded authorization request was processed. It includes provisions for scientific research, but requires public disclosure of findings and prohibits removal of the spring's water or surrounding soil beyond what's necessary for legitimate testing. Blackwood's face reddened. And the animal? Our authorization clearly extends to all relevant resources, including the horse that appears connected to these phenomena. This was the moment Thomas had been preparing for, the crux of his strategy and his greatest gamble. Grace is not a resource, he stated firmly. She's a living being who deserves freedom and protection. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a second document, which Patricia had prepared with painstaking care. This is a demonstration of the spring water's effects, witnessed and documented by Dr. Chen and these assembled journalists. With deliberate movements, Thomas uncapped the vial of spring water and poured it into his palm. He then placed his hand on Grace's forehead, directly over the white star that marked her coat. Grace found these springs. She guided me to them when I had lost hope. And now she's entrusted me to protect them, and her, from those who might exploit their power. A hushed silence fell over the gathering as the water in Thomas's palm began to glow with that now familiar luminescence. The light spread across Grace's forehead, then cascaded down her body like liquid starlight, enveloping her in a shimmering aura that elicited gasps from the onlookers. What happened next would be described differently by various witnesses, filtered through their individual perceptions and beliefs. Some would report that Grace seemed to grow more luminous, her form blurring at the edges as if dissolving into pure light. Others would insist she merely reared up dramatically before galloping away. The journalists' cameras would mysteriously malfunction at the critical moment, leaving only personal testimony to record the event. What Thomas experienced was far more profound. As the light intensified around Grace, he felt her consciousness touch his, not in words, but in pure understanding. She communicated her gratitude, her trust in him, and her purpose in finding him. The Springs needed a guardian who would protect them from exploitation, who would ensure their healing powers benefited many without being controlled by any single interest. Thomas had proven himself worthy of this role. When the light finally faded, Grace was gone. Not hidden or escaped, but truly gone, transformed or transported in a way that defied rational explanation. In her place stood a small sapling, its leaves the exact chestnut color of Grace's coat, with a single white blossom at its crown that mirrored the star on her forehead. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only when Thomas knelt beside the sapling and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the stunned gathering. "This is Grace's choice and her gift. The Springs and this tree are now one, their fates interconnected. Any attempt to remove or harm either will result in the loss of the very properties you seek to study and use." He stood, facing Blackwood directly. "You can continue your research under the terms of the Conservation Trust, transparent, limited, and with respect for what you're studying. Or you can escalate this to your superiors, who will now have to contend with public witnesses to an event that defies your classification efforts." Blackwood stared at the sapling, his carefully constructed worldview visibly crumbling in the face of what he had just witnessed. The scientists behind him whispered urgently among themselves, already theorizing explanations for the inexplicable transformation. The Clearwater executives appeared equally stunned, but David Chen was the first to recover. He approached Thomas with a mixture of awe and pragmatic business sense. "The Conservation Trust terms are acceptable to Clearwater," he stated formally. "In fact, they align with our company's sustainability initiatives and will likely enhance the water's market value. We would be honored to proceed as partners in protecting this remarkable resource." One by one, the other stakeholders found their voices. The environmental journalist pledged to document the Springs story while respecting the conservation restrictions. Sarah offered her ongoing services to monitor the health effects of the water under proper scientific protocols. Mike simply clapped Thomas on the shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both congratulations and astonishment. Blackwood was the last to speak, his authoritative demeanor somewhat diminished. "I will need to consult with my department. This is unprecedented." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "Your team can continue their current observations while you determine how to proceed within the Trust's framework. I believe we can find a balance that serves science without sacrificing ethics." As the gathering gradually dispersed, people drifting away in contemplative silence or excited discussion, Thomas remained beside the sapling. Emily approached, her eyes wide with wonder. "Dad," she whispered, "what just happened? Where's Grace?" Thomas placed a gentle hand on the sapling's slender trunk, feeling a familiar warmth radiate through his palm. "She's still here," he said softly, "just in a different form. This is what she was meant to be all along, the guardian spirit of the Springs, now rooted permanently to protect them." Emily looked skeptical but didn't argue. "And you? What does this mean for you?" Thomas gazed across his farm, seeing it with new eyes, not just as the family legacy he had fought to preserve, but as a sacred trust he had been chosen to protect. The financial salvation the Springs offered was now secondary to their deeper purpose. "It means I have work to do," he replied with quiet certainty. "Important work." As the November sun began its early descent toward the horizon, casting golden light across the land that had been in his family for generations, Thomas Morgan stood guard beside the newly transformed Grace, feeling more alive and purposeful than he had in years. The weak horse he had rescued by the roadside had, in turn, rescued him, not just from financial ruin, but from a life without meaning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever adaptations the trust might require as science grappled with the spring's mysteries, Thomas would face them with the same quiet determination that had sustained him through the darkest days of nearly losing his farm. Only now, that determination was infused with something more, a profound connection to forces larger than himself, and the honor of serving as their steward. Spring arrived at Morgan Farm with an explosion of green, transforming the once struggling property into a verdant sanctuary. 5 months had passed since Grace's miraculous transformation, and the young tree that had once been a rescued horse now stood 12 feet tall, its branches spreading with impossible vigor. The white blossoms that crowned it in winter had given way to leaves that shimmered with an inner light when the sun struck them at certain angles, drawing visitors from miles around who came to witness what local papers had dubbed the miracle tree. Thomas sat on a newly constructed bench near the tree, watching as a small group of visitors respectfully approached the cordoned area that protected both Grace and the main spring. The Morgan Springs Conservation Trust had evolved into something far more extensive than he had initially envisioned. What began as a defensive measure against government exploitation had blossomed into a community-supported ecological preserve and healing center. "Another busy day," Emily remarked, joining her father on the bench. She visited weekly now, helping to manage the trust's growing operations. "The waiting list for spring water therapy sessions is booked 3 months out." Thomas nodded, taking quiet pride in what they had built together. After Grace's transformation, the government team had eventually withdrawn, replaced by a more transparent scientific collaboration between universities and research institutions, all operating under the trust's strict ethical guidelines. Blackwood had never returned, though Thomas occasionally received formal requests for updates from his department, each more respectfully worded than the last. The partnership with Clearwater Springs had proceeded with modified terms, allowing limited bottling of water from the secondary springs while leaving the main spring untouched except for the controlled therapeutic program. The resulting product, marketed simply as Morgan Water, had become a premium brand with distribution throughout the region, providing steady income to sustain the trust's conservation efforts. "Dr. Patel called this morning," Emily continued, referring to the renowned integrative medicine specialist who had joined their advisory board. "The preliminary results from the arthritis study are even better than expected. 87% of participants showed significant improvement after just 6 weeks." Thomas wasn't surprised. He had experienced the water's healing properties firsthand, as had hundreds of others who came to the farm seeking relief from various ailments. The therapeutic program had been carefully designed to maximize benefits while preventing exploitation. Each participant contributed to ongoing research, and treatment was provided on a sliding scale to ensure accessibility, regardless of financial means. "And Sarah's new paper was accepted for publication," Emily added. "The first peer-reviewed documentation of the water's effects on cellular regeneration. She says it's already creating quite a stir in veterinary medicine circles." Thomas smiled, remembering Sarah's initial skepticism about Grace's recovery. Now she headed the trust's research division, investigating the spring's properties with meticulous scientific rigor while honoring their mysterious origins. "Dad, have you given any more thought to my suggestion?" Emily asked, changing the subject. "About writing down your experiences with Grace? People are curious about the full story, and with all these scientific papers being published, it might be good to have your perspective on record." Thomas gazed at the tree that had once been a dying horse he'd found by the roadside. How could he possibly capture in words the profound connection they had shared? The way Grace had communicated without speech had led him to discovery after discovery, had ultimately sacrificed her physical form to protect the springs. "Some things defy explanation, Em," he replied softly. "I'm not sure my story would make sense to people who weren't there." "Maybe that's exactly why it needs to be told," she countered. "To remind people that not everything in this world can be measured and categorized." Before Thomas could respond, Mike approached, clipboard in hand. Since the establishment of the trust, he had taken on the role of operations manager, overseeing the practical aspects of the farm's transformation. "The new irrigation system is up and running," he reported. Using the spring overflow to water the eastern fields has already made a difference. Those organic crops you planted are thriving. Thomas nodded in satisfaction. The trust agreement had included provisions for sustainable agriculture on portions of the farm, allowing Thomas to return to his farming roots with innovative methods that honored the land. The produce grown with minimal spring water irrigation had proven exceptionally nutritious, creating another revenue stream to support the trust's work. And the community garden plots are all assigned for the season, Mike continued. 30 local families will be growing their own food here this year. This had been Emily's idea, allocating an acre of land for community use, creating connection and food security for area residents still struggling with the economic downturn. The waiting list for plots grew longer each year. As Mike departed to oversee the installation of a rainwater collection system near the visitor center, a converted barn that now housed educational exhibits about water conservation and sustainable farming, Thomas found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. If he hadn't spotted Grace that summer day, if he hadn't made the impulsive decision to rescue her despite his own desperate circumstances, none of this would exist. The farm would likely belong to the bank by now, the springs undiscovered or perhaps exploited without regard for their true significance. "You're thinking about her again," Emily observed, recognizing the contemplative expression on her father's face. "I feel her presence every day," Thomas admitted, "especially near the tree." Indeed, in quiet moments alone with the tree that Grace had become, Thomas sometimes experienced that same wordless communication they had shared. Impressions of approval, guidance, and encouragement that flowed into his consciousness like water seeping into parched soil. The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to a school group approaching along the newly constructed nature trail. The educational program had become an unexpected success, bringing students from surrounding counties to learn about ecology, water conservation, and the delicate balance of natural systems. "Mr. Morgan," called a young teacher, waving enthusiastically, "the children have brought their drawings to show you." Thomas rose, smiling at the eager faces of the elementary school students. They had visited the previous week for a lesson on watershed protection, and he had promised to display their artwork in the visitor center. "Duty calls," he told Emily with a wink. As Thomas greeted the children, accepting their colorful drawings with appropriate admiration, he noticed a small girl who had separated from the group. She stood before Grace's tree, her head tilted back to gaze up at its spreading branches, seemingly transfixed. Thomas excused himself and approached her gently, careful not to startle her. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" he said, referring to the tree. The girl nodded solemnly. "She's talking to me," she whispered. Thomas felt a familiar tingle at the base of his spine. "Is she? What is she saying?" The child closed her eyes, her face serene with concentration. "She says the water remembers. It remembers everything, where it's been, who touched it, what it's seen. That's why it can heal." Thomas knelt beside the girl, his heart pounding. "Does she say anything else?" The girl opened her eyes and looked directly at Thomas with a wisdom beyond her years. "She says thank you, for listening when others wouldn't, for believing when others couldn't." Tears pricked at Thomas's eyes as the girl smiled and skipped away to rejoin her classmates, already chattering about the tadpoles they had spotted in the new pond. She seemed entirely unaware of the profound message she had delivered, or its impact on the weathered farmer who remained kneeling in the dappled shade of Grace's branches. That evening, after the visitors had departed and the farm settled into twilight tranquility, Thomas returned to the tree alone. The spring beside it gurgled softly, its waters catching the last golden rays of sunset. He placed his hand on the smooth bark, feeling the familiar warmth that was Grace's essence flowing through the living wood. "I miss you," he said simply. "The way you were. But I understand why things had to change." A gentle breeze stirred the branches overhead, sending a shower of tiny white petals spiraling down around him. One landed on his outstretched palm, perfectly star-shaped, like the marking that had adorned Grace's forehead. Thomas smiled, accepting the silent response. In the months since Grace's transformation, he had gradually come to understand that she hadn't disappeared or sacrificed herself. She had evolved into a form that could more effectively protect the springs and extend their healing influence. As a horse, she had been limited by physical constraints. As the guardian tree, she was literally rooted to the springs, drawing their energy upward and dispersing it through her branches and leaves to the surrounding ecosystem. The following morning brought David Chen from Clearwater Springs for their quarterly review meeting. The company had proven to be an ethical partner, respecting the trust's restrictions and helping to establish sustainable harvesting practices that preserved the spring's integrity. Sales continue to exceed projections, David reported as they walked the property. The limited availability creates demand, of course, but it's more than that. People say they can feel the difference between our water and competitors. Some claim it's changed their lives. Thomas nodded, unsurprised. The key is maintaining the balance. Take too much, and the special properties diminish. They paused at the edge of the main spring, where a simple stone marker had been installed, inscribed with the trust's guiding principle: to heal without harm, to use without depleting, to protect for generations to come. We've been approached about expansion, David admitted, opening similar bottling operations at other spring sites. The potential profits would be substantial. And your response? Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. David had become a true believer in the trust's mission. I told them Morgan Springs cannot be replicated, David replied. What happens here is unique, a convergence of the right water, the right place, and the right guardian. He glanced meaningfully at Grace's tree. Besides, the current model is sustainable and profitable. Why risk diluting something special for short-term gain? Thomas clapped him on the shoulder in approval. Exactly right. After David departed, Thomas made his usual rounds of the property, checking on the various projects underway. The farm had become a hive of purposeful activity, researchers collecting data, gardeners tending plots, visitors seeking healing, students learning about conservation. What had once been a failing family farm on the brink of foreclosure was now a thriving center for ecological restoration and holistic wellness. Yet amid all this transformation, Thomas had maintained the essential character of Morgan Farm. The old farmhouse still stood, though now it housed administrative offices for the trust alongside Thomas's living quarters. The barn had been repurposed rather than replaced. The fields still produced crops, albeit with more sustainable methods. It was change without destruction, progress that honored the past. As sunset approached, Thomas made his way to the highest point on the property, a gentle hill overlooking the springs, the tree, and the bustling activities below. Emily's words about recording his experiences with Grace echoed in his mind. Perhaps she was right. Future generations might benefit from understanding how an act of compassion toward a suffering animal had cascaded into something that affected so many lives. Taking a small notebook from his pocket, Thomas began to write, the words flowing more easily than he had expected. I found her on the side of the road in the worst drought summer anyone could remember. Just a bag of bones with dull eyes that still somehow held a spark of life. Common sense said to call animal control and drive on. I was facing foreclosure, could barely feed myself, had no business taking on a dying horse. But something made me stop. Something made me care. As the golden light of evening settled over Morgan Farm, Thomas continued writing, capturing the extraordinary journey that had begun with that simple act of mercy. He wrote of desperation and discovery, of healing and transformation, of learning to trust intuition over logic when confronting the mysteries of the natural world. Below him, Grace's tree stood sentinel over the springs, its leaves gently rustling in the evening breeze. The water flowed with quiet persistence, carrying its healing properties to all who approached with respect and need. And throughout the property that had been in his family for generations, new life flourished. Plants, animals, and people connected in a web of mutual benefit and reverence. Thomas paused in his writing to gaze at this vista, his heart full with the knowledge that his legacy would extend far beyond what he had imagined during those dark days before Grace entered his life. The Morgan name would not be remembered merely for farming this land, but for recognizing and protecting something precious that the land had always held within it. Something that had waited patiently for the right guardian to discover its true potential. As if in confirmation of this thought, a single beam of sunset light broke through the clouds, illuminating Grace's tree with golden radiance. The leaves shimmered with that familiar inner luminescence, visible even at this distance, a reminder of the extraordinary connection between the rescued horse and the healing springs. Thomas smiled and returned to his writing, determined to honor Grace's gift by sharing their story with the world, not as a scientific case study or a business success, but as a testament to the remarkable things that can happen when compassion meets mystery, when healing flows freely between species, and when a simple farmer finds the courage to believe in something beyond ordinary understanding. The weak horse he had found by the roadside had indeed transformed into something incredible, not just a healthy animal or even a miraculous tree, but a catalyst for healing that extended far beyond one farm, one spring, or one man's redemption. Grace's legacy would continue flowing outward like ripples in water, touching lives in ways neither of them could have imagined on that desperate summer day when their paths first crossed. And that, Thomas realized as he wrote the final words in his notebook, was the most incredible transformation of all.